I was born in a small neighborhood called Carmel Woods, located about a mile north of the town of Carmel by the sea. It was a place where people often built their own homes with the help of their neighbors. In my case, my father was a blacksmith, and his neighbors and helpers were carpenters and stonemasons and roofers and plumbers and electricians. And the group of them put together a small two-bedroom house in Carmel Woods. Well, when I was young, Carmel was perhaps I could call it a real town. It had a lot of activity associated with the Carmel Valley, which was full of orchards and farming activity. Further up the valley, cattle ranching, what have you. So Carmel was attached to that kind of activity. Over the hill in Monterey, there was a huge fishery, and Carmel was kind of part of that activity. And then there was a small component of tourism in Carmel, but that was just a small component of the town of Carmel. Carmel was a real town in those days. In terms of education, my education began at the Sunset Elementary School, which was a mile south of the center of town. So I walked 2 miles to school in the morning. After elementary school, I moved to Carmel High School, which was located on a hill overlooking the Carmel Valley to the southeast and overlooking Point Lobos State Park and the Pacific Ocean to the southwest. So sometimes in the winter, the mountains at the end of the Carmel Valley would be covered with snow, so we had this absolutely spectacular high school with snow-capped mountains to the southeast and the Pacific Ocean to the southwest. So it was a truly spectacular place. And in my freshman year, I moved to Berkeley and began as a chemistry major. In my second year, I transferred from chemistry to chemical engineering. I moved off campus and had to acquire a car to get to campus. In Carmel, everybody walked everywhere. In Berkeley, you drove your car. So I had a car, and I drove to my classes in my sophomore year. The next big event in my studies at Berkeley took place in the junior year when we began the study of a new subject in chemical engineering called unit operations. So this was a new course both for the students and for the faculty. So it was all new material for Professor Tobias, and he began with the book in one hand and a piece of chalk on the other, lecturing, until he got to the principle of lost work. Now, the principle of lost work is a classic situation in which everybody knows what it is, but nobody knows how to prove it. But Tobias was not the person to wave his hands when he couldn't prove something, and when he got to the principle of lost work, he paused, and I will quote him word for word. He paused and he said, "Lost work, lost work. What the hell is lost work? Work is work. Work isn't lost." And at that point, you could hear a pin drop. The students were absolutely shocked. We didn't say anything. Tobias didn't say anything. And after a while, he began again lecturing. He had the book in one hand and the chalk in the other, and we moved forward, having dispensed with lost work. And I remember very clearly, I was just a junior, but I remember very clearly thinking, there could be space for me in this area. There's a place for me in the academic world because Tobias and I are on the same page. He doesn't understand lost work, and I don't understand lost work. After my undergraduate work at Berkeley, I went to the University of Delaware, and there I found a program that didn't have any fluid mechanics courses, which was the basis for explaining this idea of lost work. You had to understand fluid mechanics first. But the graduate students at Delaware knew they were missing something in their education, and we had a group of students who would travel to Johns Hopkins University to listen to lectures in the mechanical engineering department. That's where I first heard Professor George Batchelor give a lecture on turbulence, about which I knew nothing, and I knew nothing after he gave his lecture. But we did travel to Johns Hopkins because we knew we were missing something in terms of our lack of knowledge of fluid mechanics. The trips to Johns Hopkins became more important because we knew there were things there that we had to learn, and we could learn some of them in the seminar program, but that's not a substitute for a course. So when I finished up at that part of my education at Delaware, I knew what I didn't know. So that was about as far as I could go in terms of fluid mechanics. So after my studies at Delaware, I moved on to a job at the experimental research lab at DuPont. As a chemical engineer, it was expected that I would participate in the group that was called the reactor design, the mass transfer and reactor design group. That's where the chemical engineers worked. And I wanted to work in the fluid mechanics group. And of course, I didn't know any fluid mechanics. I'd never had a course in fluid mechanics. So the people at DuPont thought that that was kind of ridiculous, that I would want to work in fluid mechanics, and they didn't want me to work in that group. But I persisted, and eventually they gave in, and I went to work in the fluid mechanics group at DuPont. I think I spent 4 hours every morning working for the company. I spent about 4 hours every afternoon in the library. They had a fantastic library, so I was learning fluid mechanics and working in fluid mechanics all at the same time. Half of the time was supposed to be devoted to research in that lab, and half of your time was supposed to be devoted to consulting it. I didn't want to consult, I wanted half of my time in the library. But about once a month I would travel to one of the production plants for DuPont to consult with people that are working there. And the people that worked there were all young engineers. When they had problems, they would read the operations manual, and if they couldn't solve their problem reading the operations manual, they would call the engineering research lab, and we would send somebody out there, and sometimes that was me. Most of the time I found that they had absolutely trivial problems that could be solved in a few minutes. So I was there for a day. After I solved their problem, I'd wander around and talk to people and do nothing except wait for my train to go back to Wilmington, Delaware. On that train ride home, I remember thinking to myself, I have to find a way to teach material so that my students in the future would not find themselves locked into a situation where they couldn't solve anything unless it was written for them in the operations manual. So that was an important experience for me. It was about 1% of my time. It was the time I hated the most and loved the least. But in the long run, perhaps turned out to be the most important. In 1964, the College of Engineering was just being formed on the Davis campus. It was an agricultural campus. It had ag engineering as one of their programs, but a general college of engineering it did not have. And it started in 1964. The first 2 years of the program there were common to all of the engineering disciplines. I taught solid mechanics, fluid mechanics, and heat transfer as part of that general program. Volume averaging, why did I get involved in volume averaging? I think that that actually might go back to a debate that was held on the Davis campus early on in the history of the chemical engineering department, where there was a big argument about whether you could use intuition to construct acceptable equations for multi-phase transport phenomena, or whether there was a science behind it. I wanted the science behind it because if you took the intuitive approach, you were complicit in the lack of education that those young engineers had suffered from. So I think the motivation there was that if you were going to use something in class, if you were going to write an equation and use it to solve a problem, an engineering problem that might lead to construction and action, you needed to understand what you were doing. At UC Davis, I think that Alberto Ochoa from Mexico had to stand out as being the most influential in terms of the program that I was trying to develop in terms of the method of volume averaging, because Alberto was working on the problem of diffusion reaction in porous catalysts, and really extended our understanding of volume averaging. Volume averaging really, I think, came in two steps. The first step was averaging, which led you to an unclosed problem, and closure was achieved by intuition, and that would describe work that started in papers published 66, 67, 68. The people that were involved in that were myself, Whitaker, Slattery, Jackson, and Matheron. And they were all independent of each other. So although John and I had discussed this problem endlessly while I was at Northwestern, but these were really independent papers. And they all did averaging. And none of them did closure, except I suggested how you might do closure. But the closure problem per se was not developed in that first round of study of volume averaging. It goes back to Reuben Carbonell and Dan Ryan. Dan Ryan was a master's student who studied diffusion reaction in porous media before Alberto Ochoa, and in that case we developed a closure problem that you could solve in a representative region, and the actual development took place on the bus between the airport in Houston and the hotel in downtown Houston. Reuben and I were going to a meeting in Houston, so we flew on a plane together and we talked about, well, on the plane I was trying to learn Spanish, and so I was speaking in Spanish to Reuben, and finally Reuben said, "Stop, I can't stand it anymore." You know, this is torture for me. So I stopped practicing Spanish on the airplane, and we started talking about volume averaging, and we made some progress, but the real progress was made on the bus trip from the airport to the hotel, when suddenly things fell into place and we saw the appearance of this local problem with spatially periodic boundary conditions. And so that just opened up everything, because that took us to a theory that you could compare with experiment and verify whether the theory was correct or not. Well, in 1985, I received a Fulbright scholarship to spend a academic year in France. I didn't know where to go in France. I didn't know anybody at Bordeaux, but we went to Bordeaux anyway. And when I got there, I met Michel Cantar and Didier Lassus, and I was introduced to a laboratory which was dealing almost exclusively with multi-phase transport phenomena. It was kind of an abrupt experience for me, because all of a sudden I was tossed in with a group of people who knew more about what I was doing than I knew, because they had all followed the work on volume averaging. So the first year that I was there was an extremely busy year in terms of seminars all over France and working with Michel Cantar. And we quickly found that there was much more work that the two of us could do than one could accomplish in a single sabbatical visit. So we began traveling back and forth between Davis and Bordeaux, and we would arrange to go to Bordeaux and do a little mountain climbing in the Alps, and arrange to go to Davis and do a little hiking and climbing in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So we had a very productive almost 20 years of working together on a variety of problems. And sometimes we behaved like tourists in southern France. And Michel and I would tour, but we'd also take our notes along and discuss technical matters while we were behaving like tourists. So we never left our work far behind. It had to be about 1992. I was an auditor in a class on stochastic processes in the civil engineering department. Brian Wood was a student in that class, so we both took that class together. And that was in the fall quarter. In the spring quarter, Brian took my class on volume averaging. And that summer, I went to Mexico to work with Alberto Ochoa, and Brian went to Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in eastern Washington, in the state of Washington. So there I was in Mexico working with Alberto, and there was a knock on the door, and someone came and said, we're running out of paper in the fax machine. You've got to put more paper into the fax machine. So we put more paper into the fax machine, and the fax machine ground out about 20 pages of notes coming from Brian Wood about the problem of diffusion and reaction in biological systems. And biological systems are much more complicated than just diffusion and reaction in a porous media. There are all sorts of things that are happening there within the cell, outside the cell membrane. So that was just a start in that area of analysis. And I think it took us 2 years to finish that first publication. And many other publications have followed since then with Brian Wood, who's also worked closely with Michel Cantar in Toulouse now. So I began a course that was taught from 1976 to 2001. So there was a period of 25 years where that special graduate course was taught. There was a lot of input from students, and that led to the book called The Method of Volume Averaging, which was published in 1999. Well, the Mendocino Coast reminds me of Carmel Woods in 1932. It's a fairly sparse population. Sue and I built a home by the side of a creek, or the creek is down in the canyon. So we can stand on our porch and listen to the creek in the canyon below, and we can listen to the Pacific Ocean on the shore about 200 meters to the west of us. I think that in terms of everything that I've done, what stands out when I'm reminded of it is my experience with young engineers at the operating plants for DuPont. I think that perhaps motivated virtually everything that I've done. That I think I've tried to provide a framework for young engineers to function by themselves and explore new problems. Those bachelor's degree holders should have that same avenue open to them in the future, to be able to tackle problems on their own, to be able to advance their own understanding, to make progress beyond the progress that's handed to them in terms of a operations manual. So I suspect that that's behind almost everything that I've done.